In this video, we'll discuss what to do when you get stuck in a Spanish conversation. You'll learn 4 tips about what to do when you either don't understand what someone else is saying or you don't know how to say what it is you want to say. Tip number 1 is instead of saying un poco or a little bit, as people often say and are taught to say when they're saying I only speak a little Spanish, instead say estoy aprendiendo, I'm learning. And the reason that I recommend saying estoy aprendiendo more than saying un poco or un poquito or hablo un poco español is that un poco emphasizes your limitations in Spanish, and it's kind of like a closed door on this in future conversations because it doesn't tell the Spanish speaker anything about what you're doing with your Spanish, where you're going with your Spanish, what you're trying to do with your Spanish. And again, it just emphasizes your limitations. Instead, saying estoy aprendiendo is like opening a door and emphasizing your potential or where you're going with your Spanish, that you're on this journey, and it's an invitation to the Spanish speaker to engage in that journey with you. So whether or not you're able to fully help them with whatever they need, whatever they came to the school for or the office for example, in the moment, it lets them know that you are on this journey. And so the next time that they were in the building, they're more likely to engage with you and to want to be a part of your learning process. So in order to say estoy aprendiendo, we'll do a real quick pronunciation practice. So that is estoy, which means I am. Then this one is a long one and it can be tricky because all of these vowels. So we're going to take it piece by piece. So first, aprendí, aprendiendo. So the trickiest part for people is this last part where you have the I followed by the E. So it's important that you have the diendo, aprendiendo. Altogether, it is simply estoy aprendiendo. I am learning. You can add on español there if you want. Estoy aprendiendo español. So times you might want to say this is if someone asks you, ¿hablas español? Maybe they just approach you and ask this, or potentially you've said a little bit of Spanish, and so now they want to know, like, do you speak Spanish? ¿Hablas español? And so that's a great time to respond, Estoy aprendiendo español. And another time that you might use it is after you've asked a Spanish speaker for clarification or for help in saying something in Spanish. And we're going to look at that in just a moment. So that's tip number 2. Ask for help from a Spanish speaker by saying, ¿Cómo se dice? Or how do you say? So one way to use this is to get help in the moment from a human being. But this can look different types of ways. So let's make sure you're prepared for all of the scenarios that you might find yourself in a position to use como se dice, so you can use it effectively. So one way to use como se dice is to just say como se dice and then the word in English. Como se dice backpack? How do you say backpack? Como se dice lunch? How do you say lunch? Como se dice chapter book? How do you say chapter book? Now, this is very effective if you are speaking to a bilingual individual, right? Because the person that you're asking has to both understand the English word that you are asking about and know enough Spanish to be able to translate that word for you and give you the Spanish word in the moment. But if you are speaking to someone who only speaks Spanish, who is not bilingual, that is not an effective approach, right? So one way that you can still use como se dice is to point to an object that you're referring to. Como se dice, and you point to the backpack. Como se dice, and you point to the nurse, for example. And another way to use it is to say como se dice, and then to explain or describe what you're trying to say. You don't know the word, but maybe you can talk around it. So I used this recently with a Spanish speaker. I couldn't remember the word for doorknob. So I basically asked, how do you say the part of the door that you grab to open and close it? There's a difference in these approaches though, right? So if you ask como se dice and you point to something, That is most beginner friendly because you don't have to know how to explain something in Spanish, whereas you would need to at least be an intermediate level in order to say, ¿Cómo se dice la parte de la puerta donde se agarra para abrir y cerrar la puerta? Like, um, describing the doorknob. And the limitation of como se dice and pointing to something is it has to be something that you can point to. So that's a little bit harder with concepts. So that's the limitation with this, but it can get you a good bit of the way. Como se dice? And point to the object. Tip number 3 is to ask the person, this is if you don't understand what they have said, to ask the person to go slower by saying, más despacio, por favor. Sometimes someone can just repeat what they've said, and that's enough for us to understand and get what they have just said. But sometimes we need to hear it just a little bit slower, or maybe a lot a bit slower than what they said the first time in order to really understand as much as we can. So in order to say that, we say más. And then despacio, we're going to break it down like we did before. So it's despacio, despacio, despacio. Again, that I followed by the O can be tricky for some people, so just make sure that you're pronouncing both of them. It's cio, despacio. The whole thing is más despacio, por favor, literally meaning more slow, please, or slower, please. You can add on to that optionally, estoy aprendiendo. So then you can say, más despacio, por favor, estoy aprendiendo. Slower, please, I'm learning. And tip number 4, our last tip, is to use a better tool than Google Translate and verify, ideally with a human being. So better tools than Google Translate that I recommend are DeepL and Lingui. So if I were to go into Google Translate and just type in the term field trip, then it's going to tell me that it is viaje de estudios, which translates to trip of studies. And that is wrong. No one ever says viaje de estudios. So Google Translate gives me a bad translation there. If I type in field trip into DeepL and lingüe.com, it's going to tell me it's excursión. And excursión is correct, which is great. If I type in field trip into a sentence into Google Translate and say, for example, tomorrow we're going on a field trip, it's going to do a better job than just if I give the term in isolation. So that is why I say DeepL and Lingui are better sources, especially if you're looking for vocabulary in isolation. You're just like, I just need to learn how to say this one word. However, I just want to make sure that I stipulate that DeepL and Lingui are great as language learning tools as you're trying to acquire vocabulary or figure out how to say things. These are not your go-to translation resources. Your school or district will have processes and procedures in place to make sure that when text or language goes home to families, that it is translated in an appropriate manner, which is another part of what I help schools do. So please don't go to DeepL and Lingui.com to translate materials that you are sending home, but use them to help yourself learn Spanish so that you can communicate as an individual more effectively. But then the second part of this is that you want to verify what you're saying. So you can either then, so you would say what you've learned how to say using DeepL or Lingui, and then you can ask, ¿Es correcto? Is that correct? And then they can tell you yes or no, or they might give you a different word for it. Or what I actually prefer as a question is, así se dice, which translates to, is that how you say it? Which gives them an opportunity to, again, verify for you if that was correct, or give you a more accurate or an alternative way of saying it. So none of the tools that I shared, Google Translate or Lingui or DeepL, translated field trip as paseo, but that is a very, very, very common word that people use to say field trip. And so when you have a conversation with someone and you say es correcto or así se dice, it gives them the opportunity to share with you vocabulary that maybe AI is not as familiar with, but is what is most used by real people or the population that you work with, for example. So those are my 4 tips to handle it when you are in a situation where you feel stuck in conversation. Good luck to you. Let me know how these go.